I'll be honest. I still remember the exact sound of my husband laughing with her in our kitchen after midnight. My best friend was living in our guest room because I thought she had nowhere else to go. I gave her clean towels, a spare key, space in my refrigerator, and every bit of trust one had left in me. Then one night, I woke up and found my husband's side of the bed empty. The kitchen lights were on, their voices were low, and the way they went silent when I stepped closer told me something had already happened long before I was ready to know it. My name is Laura, and I was 36 years old when I let Sarah move into our house. At the time, it felt like the kind of decision a good friend makes without thinking too hard about it. She had just gone through a brutal breakup, the kind that leaves someone standing in a parking lot with two suitcases and no idea where the next night is supposed to happen. She called me from outside a Walgreens on a rainy Thursday evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "He told me to leave," she said. "Laura, I don't know where to go." I did not ask Daniel first. That is something I think about now, though I know it would not have changed anything. I just told her to come over because Sarah had been my best friend for years, and there are some people you do not treat like guests when their life falls apart. You open the door. You make tea. You put fresh sheets on the bed. You tell yourself this is what loyalty looks like. Daniel was in the kitchen when I told him, standing by the sink in his work shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows while the dishwasher hummed behind him. He listened quietly, then nodded in that calm way of his, the way that had always made me feel like I had married a steady man. "Of course she can stay," he said. "She's your best friend." At the time, that sounded kind. Later, I would remember the sentence differently. Sarah arrived just before 9, soaked from the rain, mascara smudged under her eyes, holding herself together with the kind of fragile dignity people have when they are trying not to collapse in front of witnesses. I hugged her in the hallway before she even set her bags down. Daniel carried her suitcases to the guest room, brought her a glass of water, and gave her space without making her feel abandoned. For the first few weeks, everything felt almost natural. Sarah cooked when I worked late, folded laundry without being asked, and left little sticky notes on the fridge with grocery reminders. She fit into our rhythms so easily that I mistook the comfort for proof that nothing was wrong. We watched movies together, drank wine on the back porch, and stayed up talking while Daniel pretended not to listen from the couch. Sometimes I even felt proud of how well it worked. My husband liked my best friend. My best friend respected my marriage. Our house felt full, warm, and helpful in a way that made me believe we had done something generous and right. But generosity can blind you when the wrong person benefits from it. The first thing I noticed was not touching, flirting, or anything obvious enough to confront. It was quieter than that. It was the way their conversations seemed to already be in motion when I entered a room, then softened into something harmless once they realized I was there. Daniel would be leaning against the counter. Sarah would be sitting at the breakfast nook with her hands around a mug, and the mood would change just enough for me to feel like I had interrupted something without knowing what it was. "What were you two talking about?" I asked one morning, tying my robe tighter around my waist. Sarah smiled quickly. "Nothing serious, just job stuff." Daniel nodded. She was asking about applications. It was a perfect answer. That was what made it difficult. Everything they said made sense by itself, but the feeling underneath it never fully matched the words. I started noticing how often Sarah laughed at things Daniel said, not loudly or dramatically, but with a softness that felt too familiar. Daniel started remembering things she had mentioned in passing, small things I did not even remember her saying. Her favorite cereal, the way she liked coffee, which side of the couch hurt her back if she sat too long. None of that was proof. That was the trap. A person can explain away almost anything when they still want to believe they are safe. One evening, I came home later than usual after a staff meeting ran long. The house was mostly dark except for the warm light coming from the kitchen. Before I reached the doorway, I heard them laughing. Not polite laughter. Not casual roommate laughter. It was comfortable, low, and intimate in a way that made my hand tighten around my purse strap before I even understood why. Then I stepped into the kitchen. The laughter stopped immediately. Daniel turned toward me with a dish towel in his hand, and Sarah looked down into her coffee like the mug had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the room. "You're home early," Daniel said. I glanced at the clock over the stove. It was almost 10. Early? I asked. Sarah gave a small laugh that did not land right. He means earlier than we thought. We. That little word lodged itself somewhere in my chest. I asked what they were laughing about, and Daniel said it was nothing while Sarah said it was just random stuff. Their answers were close enough to sound harmless, but not close enough to feel honest. I stood there for another second, looking between them, waiting for either of them to explain more. Neither of them did. So I let it go. That was my mistake, but not because I was weak. I let it go because the truth would have required me to question my husband and my best friend at the same time, and I was not ready to live in a world where both of them could betray me under my own roof. A few nights later, I woke up just after midnight with a strange heaviness in my chest. Daniel was not in bed. At first, I told myself he was probably answering work emails, because that was the kind of explanation that kept life simple. Then I heard a faint sound from the hallway, something between a whisper and a laugh, and every part of me went still. I got out of bed quietly and walked toward the kitchen. The lights were low. Their voices were lower. I stopped before they could see me, standing just outside the doorway with my bare feet cold against the floor. Sarah said something I could not fully hear. Then Daniel answered, soft and careful. Just give me time, he said. She can't know yet. For a moment, I stood outside the kitchen doorway with my hand pressed lightly against the wall, because my legs suddenly felt too weak to trust. Daniel had said it so softly that another part of me tried to argue I had misunderstood him. But there are certain sentences your body understands before your mind is brave enough to accept them. Just give me time. She can't know yet. There was no innocent version of that. Not at midnight. Not in my kitchen. Not with my best friend sitting across from him while I was supposed to be asleep down the hall. I wanted to step into the room right then and demand they explain themselves, but something stopped me before I moved. It was not fear exactly. It was instinct. A quiet, cold instinct that told me if I walked in too soon, they would have time to lie together before I had enough truth to stand on. So I backed away. Slowly. Carefully. I returned to the bedroom, climbed into the bed that still held the shape of Daniel's body, and lay there in the dark with my eyes open. I could hear the faint murmur of their voices from the kitchen, though I could not make out the words anymore, and somehow that made it worse. The house I had built my marriage inside suddenly felt like it had another life moving through it at night, one I had been sleeping through like a fool. Daniel came back to bed 20 minutes later. He moved carefully, the way people move when they believe they are being quiet for someone else's comfort. But now every soft motion felt like evidence. He slipped under the blanket, turned away from me, and within a few minutes his breathing became even. I stared at the back of his head until the gray morning light started pressing through the curtains. By breakfast, I had made one decision. I would not ask him yet. I would not ask Sarah either. Not because I wanted to protect them, and not because I was pretending everything was fine. I stayed quiet because I had heard enough to know something was wrong, but not enough to stop them from turning it into a misunderstanding. If I confronted Daniel with one sentence overheard in the dark, he would tell me I was tired, stressed, imagining things. Sarah would cry, maybe even apologize for making me uncomfortable, and then both of them would become more careful. I could not let them become careful. I needed them to stay comfortable. That morning, Sarah came into the kitchen wearing one of my old sweatshirts, her hair pulled into a loose knot, looking soft and harmless in a way that almost made me hate myself for suspecting her. She poured coffee, smiled at me, and asked if I had slept okay. I looked at her over my mug. Not really, I said. Her hand paused for the smallest second before she continued stirring cream into her coffee. Daniel glanced up from his phone. Bad dreams? He asked. I smiled faintly. Something like that. Neither of them pushed. That was the first thing I noticed after deciding to watch them. Before, I might have called their silence respectful. Now it felt coordinated, like they both understood there were certain doors nobody should open unless absolutely necessary. Over the next few days, the house became a place of small measurements. I measured how quickly Daniel put his phone face down when I entered the room. I measured how often Sarah seemed to know his schedule before I mentioned it. I measured the silence that appeared whenever I walked into a conversation too late, And I measured the strange way they avoided being alone together in obvious places while somehow always finding small pockets of privacy. A morning coffee while I was in the shower. A conversation in the garage when Sarah claimed she was looking for laundry detergent. A quiet laugh from the back porch when I was upstairs folding towels. None of it was proof on its own. That was the cruelty of it. Each moment was small enough to excuse, but together they began forming something too clear to ignore. One afternoon, I came home early because a client canceled a meeting at the last minute. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a few seconds, looking at my own front door like I was about to enter a stranger's house. I do not know why I chose not to announce myself when I walked in, but I remember setting my keys down very quietly on the entry table. The house was silent at first. Then I heard movement upstairs. Not from the guest room. From my bedroom. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening as my pulse began to climb into my throat. There was a low voice, then a sharp whisper, then the soft sound of a drawer closing too quickly. When I reached the hallway, Sarah stepped out of my bedroom. She froze when she saw me. For 1 second, all the practiced softness fell off her face. Then she smiled. "You're home early," she said. There it was again. The same sentence. The same tone. The same tiny panic hidden under something ordinary. I looked past her into the room. "What were you doing in there?" She held up a bottle of lotion from my dresser, and the explanation came too fast. "I borrowed this earlier and forgot to put it back." It was possible. That was what made every lie so hard to fight. It was always possible. I nodded, stepped around her, and walked into the bedroom while she stayed in the hallway behind me. Nothing looked out of place at first. The bed was made, Daniel's side of the closet was closed, and my jewelry tray sat exactly where it always did. Then I noticed my nightstand drawer was not fully shut. Just a little open. Barely enough to matter. But inside that drawer was where I kept the spare key to our old storage unit, the envelope with emergency cash, and the little notebook where I had written passwords years ago before I became smarter about things like that. I closed the drawer slowly and turned around. Sarah was still standing in the doorway, watching me. And for the first time, I understood that whatever was happening between her and Daniel was not only emotional. They were preparing for something. Sarah stayed in the doorway of my bedroom, holding that bottle of lotion like it was proof of innocence, but I could see something behind her eyes that had nothing to do with skincare. She was nervous, not embarrassed, not caught doing something harmless. Nervous in the way people get when they realize you have noticed the wrong detail. I did not ask her about the drawer, because by then I understood that questions were useless unless I already knew the answers. If I asked why she had been near my nightstand, she would say she had knocked it open by accident. If I asked whether she had been looking for something, she would look hurt and remind me that I had invited her into my home because I trusted her. So I did what I had been doing for days. I smiled just enough to make the room survivable. Then I said, "Next time, just ask before you go through my things." Her face changed quickly, almost too quickly, and she gave me that soft, wounded look I had seen her use after every breakup, every fight, every time someone expected accountability from her. "Laura, I wasn't going through your things," she said. I nodded like I believed her, because at that point belief had become a performance too. "Okay," I said. "I just don't like people in my room." She looked down at the lotion bottle, then placed it carefully on my dresser. "Of course," she said. "I'm sorry." The apology sounded right, but something about it felt practiced, like she had already learned how to make herself small enough to avoid consequences. She stepped away from the doorway, and I watched her walk down the hall toward the guest room that no longer felt like a guest room at all. It felt like a place where something had been growing quietly behind a closed door. That evening, I checked the nightstand after Sarah went downstairs. The emergency cash was still there. The spare key was still there. The notebook was still there too, but it was not sitting the way I normally left it. The elastic band was pulled around it twice instead of once, and one corner of a page had been bent inward, small enough that I almost would not have noticed if I had not been looking for proof that my instincts were not lying to me. I opened it carefully. Most of the passwords inside were old, but there were still a few things that mattered. Storage unit information. An old email login. The details for the joint savings account Daniel and I used for house repairs and emergencies. My stomach tightened when I saw that page. I closed the notebook and put it back exactly as I found it, because suddenly this was no longer only about whispers in the kitchen or laughter that stopped too quickly. If Sarah had been looking at that notebook, then whatever was happening between her and Daniel had a practical side, a side with access, information, and maybe money. When Daniel came home that night, he kissed my cheek like usual. That was what disturbed me most. He did not look guilty. He did not look nervous. He asked about dinner, complained about traffic, and told Sarah some story from work while she leaned against the counter and laughed in that soft, familiar way that no longer sounded innocent to me. I watched them from the table. For the first time, I wondered how many versions of my husband existed in that house. The one who kissed me goodnight, the one who whispered to Sarah after midnight, and the one who might have known she was inside my bedroom while I was not home. Later, after dinner, Daniel went upstairs to shower, and Sarah said she was going to take a walk because she needed air. I watched her leave through the front door, phone in hand, hoodie pulled over her hair. Then Daniel's phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He had left it there, unlocked. For a few seconds, I stared at it without moving, because I knew this was the moment people always imagine they would handle cleanly. They tell themselves they would never check. They tell themselves privacy matters. They tell themselves trust means not looking. But trust had already been broken. I was only trying to find the shape of the damage. The screen lit up again. Sarah's name appeared at the top. The message preview said, "Did she notice the drawer?" My whole body went cold. I picked up the phone with hands that felt strangely steady, opened the thread, and scrolled slowly enough to force myself to understand every word. The messages were not frantic. They were not messy. They were calm, practical, and careful in a way that made them worse than any romantic confession could have been. Sarah had written earlier that day, "I found the notebook, but I didn't know which one mattered." Daniel had replied, "Don't touch anything else. She pays attention when she gets suspicious." I stopped breathing for a second. Then I kept reading. "Sarah, you said she wouldn't suspect me. Daniel, she trusts you. That's the whole point." That sentence hurt more than anything I had heard so far. Not because it proved the betrayal. Because it proved they had understood exactly which part of me they were using. I took pictures of the messages with my own phone, one after another, my movements quiet and mechanical. Then I scrolled farther down and found the line that made the room tilt around me. Daniel had written, "Once the money is moved, I'll tell her you can't stay here anymore. She'll think you left because of the breakup." Sarah had answered, "And then what?" Daniel replied, "Then I leave too, but not before I know what she can access." I placed the phone back on the table exactly where it had been. Same angle, same position, no trace. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window over the sink, realizing my husband and my best friend had not only been hiding something inside my home, they had been preparing to take pieces of my life with them. I sat at the kitchen table after putting Daniel's phone back, and for the first time in my marriage, I understood that staying calm was not weakness. It was protection. My hands were cold, my heartbeat was too loud, and every instinct in my body wanted me to run upstairs, drag Daniel out of the bathroom, and throw the truth in his face before he had time to breathe. But the messages had changed everything. This was not only about betrayal anymore, and it was not only about Sarah whispering with my husband in the kitchen while I slept down the hall. They were talking about money. They were talking about access. They were talking about what I could still reach before Daniel decided to leave. That meant I could not afford to be emotional first. I had to be smart first. When Daniel came back downstairs, his hair was wet from the shower, and he looked so ordinary that it almost made me dizzy. He grabbed a glass from the cabinet, filled it with water, and kissed the top of my head as he passed behind my chair, like he was still the husband I had trusted that morning. "You okay?" he asked. I looked up at him slowly. For one terrible second, I saw two versions of him standing in the same kitchen. One version kissed me gently and asked about my day. The other version had just texted my best friend about moving money and checking what I could access. I smiled because I needed him to believe I still knew only one of those men. Yeah, I said. Just tired. He believed me. That was the first thing that scared me after reading the messages. Not the lie itself. How easy it was for him to accept mine. Sarah came back from her walk 15 minutes later, cheeks flushed from the cold, phone still in her hand. She looked at Daniel first, then at me, and I saw the silent question pass through the room before either of them spoke. Did she notice? Did something happen? Are we still safe? I wanted to tell them they were not safe at all anymore, but instead I got up, rinsed my mug, and asked Sarah if she wanted tea. My voice sounded normal. Maybe too normal. But neither of them seemed to notice, because guilty people are usually too busy protecting their own performance to study yours properly. That night, I barely slept. Daniel's breathing was even beside me, while I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, replaying every message I had photographed. I thought about the notebook in my drawer, the account details, the emergency cash, and the way Sarah had stood in my bedroom wearing innocence like a borrowed sweater. By 3 in the morning, I had made a list in my head of everything that needed to be protected before either of them knew I had seen the truth. At 7, I got out of bed like any normal weekday. I made coffee. I packed my work bag. I kissed Daniel on the cheek because he leaned toward me expecting it, and I hated myself for how natural the movement still felt. Then, from my car in the parking lot of a grocery store, I called the bank. The woman on the phone sounded polite and half asleep until I told her I needed to check whether any new transfers or external accounts had been added to our joint savings. Then her tone changed, not dramatically, but carefully enough that my fingers tightened around the steering wheel. There was a login from a new device last night, she said. My mouth went dry. What time? Just after 1 in the morning. That was after Daniel had come back to bed. I closed my eyes and forced myself to stay calm. Was anything changed? There was a pause, and in that small silence, I felt the whole morning tilt under me. A new external account was added, she said. The transfer is still pending verification. I looked through the windshield at people pushing shopping carts in the gray morning light, living normal lives while mine quietly split open inside a parked car. What name is on the external account? I asked. She hesitated again. Then she said, Sarah Whitmore. For a moment, I could not speak. Sarah's last name sat there in the air between me and a stranger from the bank, and suddenly the betrayal had a paper trail. It was no longer a feeling, no longer a whisper, no longer a look across the kitchen table. It had a name, a timestamp, and a pending transfer waiting for someone to finish what they had started. I told the bank to freeze the account. The representative asked a few verification questions, and I answered them with a calmness that felt like it belonged to someone else. When the call ended, I sat in the car for several minutes, both hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. This was just insane. Not dramatic insane. Not emotional insane. Real insane. My best friend was living in my guest room while her name was being attached to my savings account, and my husband was sleeping beside me like he had not helped build the bridge between my trust and their escape plan. I drove to work, but I did not go inside right away. Instead, I opened my phone and sent the screenshots to a private email Daniel did not know about. Then I changed the passwords I could change from my car, enabled alerts on every account, and wrote down every detail while it was still fresh. Times, messages, names, the drawer, the notebook, the bank call. By the time I finally walked into the office, I was not crying anymore. I was documenting. That evening, I went home knowing they would both be there, and for the first time, I was not walking into my house as a wife or a friend. I was walking in as someone gathering evidence. Daniel was in the kitchen when I arrived. Sarah was beside him, and on the counter between them was my old password notebook. The notebook was sitting on the kitchen counter between Daniel and Sarah, open like it belonged there, and for a few seconds I could not move because seeing it in the middle of the room felt more violating than finding it missing. It was not hidden anymore. It was not tucked inside my drawer, under old receipts and a loose pack of batteries, where I had left it because I still believed private things stayed private in my own bedroom. It was lying there under the kitchen lights, with Daniel's hand resting beside it and Sarah standing close enough to see every page. They both turned when I walked in. Daniel's face changed first, though only for a second. He recovered quickly, the way he always did when he wanted to make something seem smaller than it was. Sarah looked down at the notebook, then back at me, and the panic in her eyes was not strong enough to become a confession, but it was too strong to be innocent. I placed my purse on the chair slowly. "What are you doing with that?" I asked. Daniel looked at the notebook like he had only just noticed it. "I found it upstairs." That was his first mistake, because he did not say Sarah found it. He said he did. I looked at Sarah, and she wrapped both hands around her coffee mug even though it was empty. "Upstairs where?" I asked. Daniel closed the notebook with 2 fingers, like the pages were suddenly embarrassing. "Your drawer was open." I thought maybe you left it out. I stared at him, and for one moment the whole room seemed to shrink around the lie. He had chosen something simple, something that could almost pass if I had not already spoken to the bank, photographed his messages, and noticed the drawer myself the day before. "My drawer was open," I repeated. His jaw shifted. "A little." Sarah looked at him quickly. Too quickly. That one glance gave me more than either of them knew. I walked to the counter, picked up the notebook, and held it against my chest. Not because I needed to protect the paper anymore, but because I needed them to understand that something of mine had been touched, moved, studied, and handed back only because I had walked in sooner than they expected. "Did either of you read it?" I asked. Sarah spoke before Daniel could. "No, of course not." The answer came too fast. Daniel nodded, but his eyes were on me now, studying my face with a focus that felt almost surgical. He was trying to decide how much I knew. I could feel it. He wanted to know whether I had seen the messages, whether I had called the bank, whether I was only suspicious or already dangerous to whatever plan he had built with her. So I gave him nothing. I set the notebook back down, but this time I kept my hand on top of it. "That's strange," I said, because the page with our savings information was bent. The kitchen went quiet. Sarah swallowed. Daniel did not blink. That was when I knew he was better at this than she was. "Maybe it was already like that," he said. "Maybe," I replied. I watched both of them carefully, letting the words sit there until it became uncomfortable. Before all of this, I would have filled that silence myself. I would have softened it, explained my mood, made a joke, or given them both a way out because tension made me anxious. Not anymore. Now tension was useful. Daniel finally stepped closer, lowering his voice into the warm, patient tone he used when he wanted me to feel unreasonable. "Laura, what's going on with you?" he asked. I almost smiled. There it was. The turn. Not "what are we doing with your notebook?" Not "why would Sarah's name be connected to our account?" Not "I'm sorry your private things were touched." Just "what's going on with you?" I looked at my husband, then at the woman I had brought into our home because I thought she needed safety, and I felt something cold settle into place inside me. "I called the bank today," I said. Sarah's mug slipped slightly in her hands and hit the counter with a small ceramic sound. Daniel's face stayed calm, but his body did not. His shoulders pulled back just enough for me to see the sentence land. "What bank?" he asked. That was almost funny. Almost. "Our bank," I said. "The joint savings account with the new external account attached to it." Sarah looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. And in that tiny triangle of silence, everything in the room became honest, even if neither of them had spoken yet. I continued before he could start shaping another lie. The account under Sarah's name was added after 1 in the morning. The transfer was still pending when I called, so they froze it. Daniel's expression changed then. Not dramatically. Not with guilt. With irritation. That hurt more than shame would have, because irritation meant he was not horrified by what he had done. He was annoyed that I had interrupted it. Sarah started crying quietly, but I did not look at her right away. I knew her tears too well. I knew how easily they pulled people toward her, how quickly a room could rearrange itself around her sadness until the person she had hurt became responsible for comforting her. I kept my eyes on Daniel. "Were you going to tell me before or after the money was gone?" I asked. He exhaled sharply. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that." "No," he said, his voice tightening. "I was trying to separate things cleanly before this became a mess." I stared at him. Before this became a mess. As if the mess began when I noticed it. As if the betrayal, the whispering, the drawer, the notebook, and the pending transfer were all just background details until my awareness made them inconvenient. Sarah finally spoke, her voice small and breaking. "He told me you already knew things were ending." I turned to her slowly. For the first time, she looked scared of Daniel, not just scared of me. "He said you were only staying calm until everything was divided," she whispered. "He said the money had to be moved before you changed your mind." Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Sarah, stop talking." The way he said it chilled the room. Not loud, not aggressive, controlled. But I heard the command inside it. And so did she. I looked between them, and suddenly I understood the ugliest part of all. Daniel had been lying to me, using her, and preparing an exit where my trust became the thing that financed his freedom. Sarah had betrayed me too, absolutely, but she had also believed whatever version made her feel less like a thief and more like someone chosen. I picked up my phone. Daniel's eyes moved to it immediately. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Calling my lawyer." His face hardened. "Laura, don't make this worse." I looked at the notebook, then at Sarah, then back at him. "You already made it worse when you put her name on our money." Before I could unlock the screen, another notification appeared. It was from the bank. The frozen transfer had not been the only one. A second request had just been attempted from Daniel's login. And this time, the amount was everything. The bank notification stayed on my phone while Daniel and Sarah stood in front of me, and for one awful second, nobody in that kitchen seemed to breathe. The message was simple, almost cold in how professional it looked. A second transfer had been attempted from Daniel's login, and this time, it was not a test amount or a small withdrawal that could be explained away later. It was everything. Every dollar in the account we had built for house repairs, emergencies, future plans, and all the normal adult things you save for when you believe the person beside you is building the same life. It was the money from my overtime, Daniel's bonuses, the tax refund we decided not to spend, and the careful little deposits I made whenever I told myself we were being responsible. I stared at the screen long enough for the words to burn into me. Then I looked up at Daniel. He already knew. That was the worst part. He did not ask what the alert meant. He did not look confused. He did not step closer with concern or reach for his own phone like a man surprised by fraud. He just stood there with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on mine, silently calculating how much truth I had in my hands. Sarah whispered, "Daniel, what did you do?" He turned to her sharply. "Don't." That one word told me everything about the shape of their secret. Sarah had betrayed me, yes, but Daniel had been controlling more than I realized. He had made her believe some version where I already knew, where our marriage was already ending, where moving money was just part of separating things cleanly. And maybe she had wanted to believe that because it made her feel less guilty. Maybe she had accepted every convenient lie because it let her keep taking comfort, attention, and whatever promise Daniel had handed her in the dark. But now, standing in my kitchen, she looked like someone seeing the real plan for the first time. I called the bank immediately. Daniel stepped toward me, and I stepped back before he could get close. "Laura," he said, lowering his voice, "you need to calm down before you make this worse." I almost laughed because the sentence was so perfect in its cruelty. He had tried to move our money, used my best friend's account, watched her search through my private things, and now he was telling me I was the one creating danger by reacting. "No," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "You don't get to use calm against me." The bank representative answered, and I put the call on speaker because I wanted both of them to hear the words clearly. I verified my identity with hands that felt numb, confirmed I had not authorized the transfer, and asked for every pending movement from the account to be blocked immediately. The representative's tone changed when I said the transfer was connected to my husband's login and an external account in another woman's name. She became careful, professional, almost gentle. That gentleness nearly broke me. Strangers become gentle when they realize your life has just turned into evidence. Sarah started crying quietly near the counter, but I did not look at her. I could not afford to let her tears pull me into old habits. For years, when Sarah cried, I softened. I explained her mistakes. I gave her another chance because friendship had history, and history can feel like a debt if you are not careful. But that night, her tears were not my responsibility. When the bank confirmed the account had been frozen, I asked them to send written confirmation to my email. Then I asked for logs of the external account request, the device access, and the attempted transfer times. Daniel's face changed at the word logs. That was when I knew he had not expected me to become this organized. He had expected emotion. He had expected crying. He had expected me to collapse into the role of betrayed wife while he managed the practical damage. Instead, I was building a record. When I ended the call, the kitchen was painfully still. Daniel rubbed a hand over his mouth, then said, "You don't understand what was happening." I looked at him across the counter, at the man who had slept beside me after whispering with my best friend, at the husband who had been planning to leave, but wanted to know what I could access first, and I felt something final settle into place. "Then explain it without lying," I said. He did not answer. "Sarah did. He told me you were already talking about divorce," she whispered. "He told me you were hiding money first." I looked at her, and for the first time that night, I saw not only betrayal but cowardice. She had wanted my life badly enough to believe the ugliest version of me without ever asking me one honest question. "You lived in my house," I said. "You slept under my roof. You watched me make breakfast, go to work, pay bills, and trust both of you. And you never once thought to ask me if any of that was true." She lowered her eyes. That was her answer. Daniel stepped closer again, and this time his voice had lost the warmth completely. "You're going to regret turning this into something legal," he said. The room went silent. Even Sarah stopped crying. I looked at him carefully, because that was not an apology, not panic, and not even a defense. It was a threat. I picked up the notebook, my purse, and my phone, then backed toward the hallway without taking my eyes off him. "I'm leaving," I said. "And the next person you hear from will not be me." Daniel's expression shifted so quickly that I almost missed it. Fear. Real fear. Then Sarah looked at me and whispered the sentence that made the whole night even worse. "Laura, there's something else in the guest room you need to see before you go." Sarah's words stopped me before I reached the front door, but they did not make me trust her. They only made the house feel more dangerous. For a few seconds, I stood in the hallway with my phone in one hand, my purse over my shoulder, and the old password notebook pressed against my side. Daniel stood behind me in the kitchen, suddenly silent, while Sarah looked at me like she had finally reached the edge of a lie she could no longer carry alone. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Sarah glanced at Daniel before answering, and that one glance almost made me walk out anyway. Even after everything, some part of her was still checking whether she had permission to tell the truth. Daniel's voice came low from the kitchen. "Sarah, don't." She flinched. "Not much, but enough." I turned toward him slowly. "Do not speak for her." His face hardened, and for the first time that night, I saw the anger beneath all his calm explanations. The gentle husband was gone now. The careful man who kissed my forehead and asked if I wanted dinner was gone too. What remained was someone who had lost control of the room and hated every second of it. Sarah stepped away from the counter. "In my suitcase," she said, barely above a whisper. "There's a folder." Daniel moved first. That told me everything. He took one sharp step toward the hallway, and before I could think, I lifted my phone and said, "If you go near that room, I'm calling the police right now." He stopped. The word police changed the air more than lawyer had. Sarah started crying again, but this time her tears felt different. They were not soft or helpless. They looked frightened, like she understood that whatever was in that folder could no longer be hidden behind apologies and sad explanations. I walked toward the guest room without waiting for either of them. The hallway seemed longer than it had ever been. Every step felt strange because I was walking through my own house as if it were a place where evidence had been planted. The guest room door was half open, and the little lamp beside the bed was on, casting warm light over the room I had prepared for Sarah with clean sheets, folded towels, and the stupid hope that helping her would make her feel safe. Her suitcase sat near the closet. Open. Clothes spilled over one side, but the front pocket was zipped shut. I looked back once. Daniel was standing in the hallway, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the suitcase. Sarah stood behind him, shaking so badly she had wrapped both arms around herself. I opened the pocket. Inside was a plain manila folder, bent at the corner from being shoved too quickly into place. I pulled it out and set it on the bed, and for a moment I could not bring myself to open it. Not because I did not want to know, but because I understood that whatever came next would remove the last fragile excuse still standing between me and the full truth. Then I opened it. The first page was a printed bank statement. Ours. The second was a copy of the pending transfer request. The third was a list of account balances, passwords, and security questions written in Sarah's handwriting. My stomach turned. I looked up at her. She covered her mouth with one hand and whispered, "He told me to write it down." Daniel laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That's not what happened. I ignored him and kept looking through the folder. There were screenshots of rental listings. 2-bedroom apartments. Not in my name. Not in our neighborhood. One page had a unit circled in red pen, with a move-in date only 3 weeks away. 3 weeks. That number hit me harder than I expected. They had not been living in a vague fantasy or some emotional confusion they planned to sort out eventually. They had dates, addresses, money movement. A future being built quietly inside the house where I still cooked dinner and folded his shirts. Then I found the page that made my hands stop moving. It was a handwritten timeline. Sarah's handwriting again. Transfer money. Tell Laura Sarah is moving out. Daniel stays 2 more weeks. File separation papers. Keep things calm. Keep things calm. I stared at those 3 words until they blurred. That was what I had been to them. Not a wife. Not a friend. Not a person whose whole life was being dismantled by the people she trusted most. I was a situation to keep calm. Sarah stepped closer, but I lifted my hand without looking at her. Don't. She stopped immediately. I didn't know he was going to take everything, she said. I thought he was just moving his half. I looked at her then, and something in me finally broke away from the history between us. She was telling the truth now, or part of it, but her truth came after she had already opened my drawer, copied my account information, and let herself believe whatever made betrayal easier to swallow. You thought helping him move money behind my back was fine, I said. As long as he called it his half. Her face crumpled. No answer. Daniel stepped into the doorway, his voice lower now. Laura, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. That sentence almost made me laugh. I held up the folder. You made a folder. He looked at it, then at me, and for the first time, he did not have a clean response. That was when my phone buzzed. A new email from the bank had arrived with the written confirmation I had requested. The transfer was frozen. The account was flagged. And the attempted movement of funds was documented under Daniel's login. I looked at him over the top of the phone. His face changed when he saw that I was no longer afraid. I was protected. Not completely. Not safely. But enough to move. I put the folder inside my purse, along with the notebook, then stepped past him into the hallway. He did not block me this time. Maybe he knew I would call the police. Maybe he understood that the story had finally moved beyond the walls of our house. At the front door, Sarah said my name. I stopped, but I did not turn around. I really did love you, she whispered. For a moment, I closed my eyes. Because that was the cruelest part. Maybe she had. Maybe in some damaged, selfish, broken way, my best friend had loved me while helping my husband prepare to leave me and take my security with him. But love without loyalty is just attachment. And attachment was not enough to save anything now. I opened the door. Then Daniel said one last thing behind me. You won't be able to prove I meant to take it. I turned back slowly and looked at him standing in the house we had built together. Then I lifted the folder slightly. No, I said. But I can prove you tried. I left the house with the folder in my purse, the notebook under my arm, and a kind of calm I did not recognize in myself until much later. Daniel did not follow me outside. Maybe he finally understood that the room had changed, or maybe he only realized that following me would create another fact he could not explain away. Sarah stayed near the hallway, crying quietly into her hands, but I did not stop for her. I had stopped for her too many times already, and every time I had, She had learned that my kindness could be used as shelter. That night, I drove to a hotel across town and parked under the brightest light I could find. For almost 5 minutes, I sat in the car without opening the door, staring at the dark windshield while the house key still hung from the ring beside the ignition. I remember looking at it and thinking how strange it was that a key could feel useless so quickly. It still opened the front door, still turned in the same lock, still belonged to the same address, but the home behind it no longer belonged to the woman I had been that morning. When I finally got inside the hotel room, I spread everything across the small desk. The bank emails, the screenshots, the folder from Sarah's suitcase, the notebook they had touched, the transfer alerts, the handwritten timeline. I looked at all of it under the yellow lamp, and for the first time, the betrayal stopped feeling like a storm and started looking like a map. There were dates now, names, login times, account requests, messages written by people who thought I would never see them. At 6 the next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Denise, and she had the kind of voice that made panic feel slightly less powerful. I told her about Daniel, Sarah, the messages, the bank transfer, the folder, and the fact that my best friend had been living in our guest room while helping my husband prepare to move money out of our shared account. She did not gasp. She did not tell me to calm down. She only said, "Do not go back there alone." Those 6 words made me cry harder than any comfort would have. Because sometimes the thing that breaks you is not the betrayal itself. It is the first moment someone outside the lie confirms that you are right to be afraid. By noon, Denise had contacted the bank, requested preservation of the records, and told me to file a police report about the attempted transfers and unauthorized access to my private information. She also told me not to answer Daniel's calls, not to meet Sarah alone, and not to let either of them pull me into emotional conversations where the truth could become foggy again. Daniel called 11 times that day. Sarah called twice. Then the messages started. Daniel wrote that I was overreacting, that the money was marital money, that he had only been trying to separate things fairly before I made everything ugly. Sarah wrote that she was sorry, that she never meant to become involved in something that hurt me, and that Daniel had lied to her too. Maybe he had. That did not save her. Being lied to by the man she betrayed me with did not erase the fact that she had stood in my bedroom, opened my drawer, copied information from my notebook, and let herself believe whatever version made her actions easier to live with. The next day, Sarah sent one message that mattered. It was not an apology. It was a statement. She wrote that Daniel had told her our marriage was already over, that I knew they were separating finances, and that he had asked her to help because he believed I would make things difficult if I found out too soon. She admitted he had asked her to look for account details, admitted the folder was hers, and admitted the external account was opened with the expectation that money would be moved there before I knew. I forwarded it to Denise without replying. That was one of the first times I understood real strength does not always look like saying the perfect thing. Sometimes it looks like saying nothing and sending the evidence to the right person. A week later, I went back to the house with my brother and a police officer present while I collected my things. Daniel was not there when I arrived, which was probably the best decision he had made in days. Sarah's guest room was empty. The bed was stripped, the closet door was open, and the little basket of towels I had placed there for her was still sitting on the dresser like a joke no one had the heart to remove. I stood in that doorway longer than I should have. That room had been where I thought I was helping someone heal. Instead, it had been where she kept a folder full of my life. My brother touched my shoulder gently and said, "You don't have to look at it." But I did. I needed to. I needed to see the room clearly, without the story I had built around it. No best friend rebuilding her life. No temporary guest. No safe little arrangement between people who loved me. Just a room where trust had been turned into opportunity. Daniel moved out before the end of the month. Not gracefully, not quietly, but completely. The divorce process was ugly in the way legal things can be ugly, with emails, documents, formal language, and people discussing the end of your marriage as if they are negotiating repairs on a fence. He tried to claim I had misunderstood the transfers. He tried to say Sarah had acted on her own. He even tried to suggest that I had always been anxious about money and was exaggerating because of the affair. But the records did not care how reasonable he sounded. The bank logs stayed. The messages stayed. Sarah's statement stayed. And that handwritten timeline with the words "keep things calm" stayed too. Eventually, Daniel stopped fighting the story and started fighting only the consequences, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he had become. Or maybe more painfully, what kind of man he had always been when nobody was watching closely enough. Sarah left town 3 months later. I heard it from a mutual friend who did not know whether telling me would hurt or help. She had moved in with an aunt in Memphis, deleted most of her social media, and apparently told people she had made the biggest mistake of her life. I believe that. But regret is not repair. It does not put money back into an account, restore privacy to a drawer, or return safety to the walls of a house you once loved. The house was sold before the year ended. I thought walking away from it would destroy me because I had painted those walls, planted herbs in the backyard, and imagined growing old with Daniel in rooms that now felt contaminated. But on the last day, after the movers were gone, I stood in the empty kitchen and felt something I did not expect. Relief. The room had no voices left in it. No whispers after midnight. No laughter stopping when I entered. No woman sitting at my counter pretending to be broken while helping my husband break me. Just empty space. And empty space, I learned, can be merciful. I moved into a smaller place on the other side of town, an apartment with too much sunlight in the mornings and a balcony just big enough for one chair and a plant I kept forgetting to water. It was not the life I had planned, but it was mine in a way the house had not been for a long time. No one had a spare key except my brother. No one knew where I kept my documents. No one entered my bedroom unless I wanted them there. For a while, that made me sad. Then it made me free. Months later, Sarah sent me one final email. It was long, full of apologies, explanations, and sentences about how Daniel had manipulated her while she was vulnerable. I read the whole thing once, not because I owed her that, but because I wanted to know whether any part of me still needed something from her. When I reached the end, I realized I did not. I closed the email without answering. Not every apology deserves a doorway back into your life. Daniel never gave me a real apology. He sent one message through his attorney that said he regretted how things unfolded, which felt so empty it almost became funny. How things unfolded. As if betrayal were a tablecloth caught in the wind and not a series of choices made in my kitchen, my bedroom, and my bank account. I did not need his apology either. That surprised me most. For a long time, I thought healing would come when they finally understood what they had done. But healing came when I stopped needing them to understand it. It came when my days no longer revolved around the question of how people I loved could do something so calculated and still sleep at night. One evening, almost a year after Sarah moved into our house, I woke up just after midnight in my new apartment. For 1 second, my body remembered the old fear. I listened for low voices, for kitchen laughter, for the sound of someone whispering a life without me into existence. But there was nothing, only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and rain tapping gently against the balcony door. I got up, made tea, and stood barefoot in my own kitchen until the fear passed. That was when I understood the real ending of the story. It was not the divorce. It was not the frozen transfer. It was not Daniel leaving or Sarah disappearing. The real ending was that I could stand in a kitchen after midnight and feel safe again. And after everything they tried to take, that was the one thing I fought hardest to keep.